Bring out your fancy Primaris hover rhinos, because today we're talking Impulsors. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where today we're taking an in-depth look at the Space Marine Impulsor, talking about its pros and cons, the best ways to use it, and whether or not it's good in more competitive lists. It's been a couple of years since this Primaris Grav Rhino came out, and it still remains a little bit niche throughout Space Marine collections. They're quite expensive to buy from Games Workshop, though perhaps are a little bit more tempting to get your hands on now one comes in that Blood Angels Combat Patrol box. At least bundled with some other miniatures, you get a small discount. If you were looking to pick one up, I do have an Element Games link down in the video description. They usually give 10 to 20% off Games Workshop's miniatures, and are a nice discount store based in the UK. In any case though, let's talk tactics, and have a look at the Impulsor's datasheet. So the Impulsor is a dedicated transport choice for Codex Space Marines. It costs 110 points base, so as they go it's a relatively pricey transport option, but it does have some really cool features. First up, it has a great movement of 14 inches, really good for getting Primaris where they need to go, and has 11 wounds compared with the Rhino's 10, though at base I'd still say it's less durable for the cost because it's 10 points per wound rather than 8. At base it comes equipped with Storm Bolters, but it does have a fair amount of extra kit and options that it can take. At the very least though, it can put out some fairly reasonable anti-infantry firepower. Obviously the Impulsor's main function is getting Primaris units where they need to go, though it does have a slightly limited transport capacity of only 6 models. You can take 6 Primaris infantry, and it can't transport drum pack or Gravis models, so no suppressors or aggressors in the transport, I'm afraid. Only having 6 models does usually mean that you need to invest quite a lot of points in the transport itself compared with the actual points of the models it's transporting. It just does make it a little bit less efficient for things like intercessors that are relatively cheap and sturdy. So usually you're going to want to gravitate towards more high-end, hard-hitting Primaris units, things like Blade Guard or Hellblasters. Having 6 slots is kind of helpful though. You can have a 5-man unit and then also a support character if you want one. The most interesting unique thing about the Impulsor is the Assault Vehicle special rule, where units can disembark from the transport even if it made a normal move in the movement phase. It's such a good rule for getting threats up the board really quickly. It means you can move this thing 14 inches, get out up to 3 inches away, and then potentially even go on to move that unit that you just disembarked as well, and get yet more movement up the board. If you need to put a squad in a really aggressive position and potentially still shoot after that, then you can. But if you do use it this way, then it means that you can't make a charge move later that turn, which to be honest, if you could, it would be pretty silly. You could have Marines charging literally all the way across the table. It kind of gives it a little bit more natural synergy with shooting units, if it does have the right unit to transport. In terms of options, as we mentioned, it has several. First up, it can swap those Storm Bolters for some Fragstorm grenade launchers, 18-inch range and Assault D6 weapons with the Blast special rule. I really could go either way on these compared with the Storm Bolters. The Storm Bolters are going to get you more shots both at 24-inch range and at 12-inch range. These will get you more shots between 12 and 18 inches, and they're kind of handy that they don't stop your Impulsor from advancing, so you can get some absolutely maximal movement out of it. Both are good. I perhaps have a slight preference for the Storm Bolters myself, but I think there's really not all that much in it. Next, for 5 points, you can bolt on an Iron Hail Heavy Stopper on the top hatch. I see most people just keeping their Impulsor as cheap as possible and leaving this off, but to be honest, for 5 points I think it's really quite good value. You get 4 shots at 36-inch range, Strength 4 and AP -1, and more in the Devastator Doctrine, and almost whatever you target with that, you have a reasonable chance of making your points investment back out of it, even if it only fires once per game. I do quite like having a little bit more long-range anti-infantry fire to just stack a little bit more hurt on depleted squads from all the way across the table. I'd be quite tempted to include it myself. Finally, you have the 4 top hatch options, where you can either leave it with no further upgrade, or take either a Shield Dome, Orbital Comms Array, Bellicaster's Missile Array, or an Iron Hail Sky Talon. Sadly, you can't combine more than one of these as it takes up the hard points. The Sky Talon is the cheapest at 10 points, 36 inches for 8 more shots at Strength 4, AP -1, Damage 1, with a random extra rule that if you attack an aircraft model with it, you get +1 to hit. I just see this as more heavy stubber shots, to be honest. It's not really going to be very efficient against aircraft as it's low strength and 1 damage, so I'd just target some enemy infantry. Again, like the Iron Hail, it is very cheap firepower for the points, and I would strongly consider it if I wasn't taking a Shield Dome. Talking of which, the Shield Dome is 15 points and gives it a 5+ invul save, and as transports are mainly about being durable and being fast, I'd say this is one of the best upgrades you can give it. I'll come back to that on the next slide and talk about why I think it's perhaps the best upgrade. Next we have the Orbital Comms Array for 15 points, and that allows you to call down an orbital barrage. The way you use it is to select one point on the battlefield, you roll the dice to see how far the range of it affects, and then for every unit within that range, on a 4+ they take d3 mortal wounds. It's a bit random, but to be honest it is surprisingly potent. You don't even have to have the Impulsor see the target for this, and it could really punish any enemy army that's really bunched up at the start of the game and hand out a bunch of random mortal wounds. Again, if not taking a shield dome, I really don't think that this is a bad use of points. Sure, you could roll really low and only be affecting 1 or 2 units, but with a good roll you could be getting 6 or more, and that's a lot of mortal wounds. I think it's the sort of thing that I only take 1 of though, as you can only use it once per command phase. Finally, and the most pricey option, is the Bellecaster's missile array for 20 points. It's a fairly standard missile launcher that fires either frag or crack missiles, with the interesting different option to fire Icarus missiles for d3 autocannon shots that are better against aircraft. If you're just looking to add it as a bit more of a credible firepower threat to your army, and you've got lots of other vehicles around with heavy firepower, it might not be the worst choice in the world, but I feel that compared with the other upgrades, you maybe aren't getting quite as an impressive return on your investment for what you're putting in. Still though, not the worst, all of the top hatch upgrades seem usable, and I typically take one of them when I'm fielding the tank. Overall, I describe the Impulsor as a fairly premium Primaris transport. You pay quite a lot of points for it, but it gets good movement and that fun assault vehicle special rule. 2 really nice advantages for a transport to have. Talking of the shield dome though, I do think it's probably the most competitive option, basically paying 15 points for a 5+ invul, which you could essentially see as an extra 13% on the cost of the vehicle. Generally for transports, perhaps the 2 most useful attributes it can have are speed plus durability. The damage is nice, but kind of incidental compared with what you could get on heavier firepower units. The Impulsor, as we said, just really isn't all that durable for the points, but the shield dome certainly helps it get there and be more of an annoying threat to remove. Of course, only being a 5+ invul on a 3+ save model, it's going to do nothing against AP0, AP-1 or AP-2 or any mortal wounds that come in. However, it really does shine against high AP weapons. Anything that's AP-3 will take an extra 25% more shots to kill it, something like around 6 las cannons rather than 4 or 5, and anything that's AP-4 will take an extra 50% shots to kill the tank, for example around about 5 Dark Lance hits rather than between 3 and 4. Overall, just as a general rule of thumb, the things that the Impulsor usually has to fear tend to be in the higher AP brackets, particularly things like las cannons and lances, and I think that usually means that the shield dome is worth it. The majority of things with lower AP don't tend to have quite as much damage, though obviously there are plenty of individual exceptions. Overall, I'd say that the shield dome does tend to be worth it. Certainly the vast majority of Impulsors that are played in competitive lists do seem to take one. As a transport, perhaps buffs and synergies aren't the biggest deal for the Impulsor. In particular, most chapters will work fairly well for it, it just depends on what you're putting in the tank. Impulsors tend to be really quite common picks for more assault-orientated chapters to deliver some scary blade guard into melee. Maybe a couple of particularly notable ones are the Black Templars, who could make some gamey charges by using Devout Push combined with the assault vehicle special rule. That's their stratagem that randomly allows them to consolidate into combat, even if they can't technically charge. It allows them to get some crazy charges out of blade guard from across the table. Space Wolves also seem to be fairly big users of them as well. Obviously they'll love getting their blade guard into combat, but I think also they're quite useful in combination with a Rune Priest, which can cast an aura of light cover around them, hopefully giving them a 2+ save against enemy fire, and you could also double down with their stratagem for an aura of -1 to hit to make your transports really tough to kill for the turn that they're moving up. Lots of other chapters have minor advantages as well, but maybe the other really significant one are Iron Hands, extra durability with their Feel No Pain, slower degrading, and all manner of vehicle synergies throughout the codex are all good things. Characters wise, Tech Marines could potentially repair the Impulsor a bit if they wanted, though usually I think that those repairs are better going to be directed at tanks or dreadnoughts, and I guess you could use Psychic Fortress with a Librarian to give an Impulsor a 5+ invul save if you happen not to take a shield dome. I feel that might just be a bit more of a risky strategy though. If the power gets denied, or your opponent gets first turn and can still get some shots off, then it's just not going to be protected compared with shelling out for the relatively cheap shield. Finally, stratagems wise, it has access to Grav Pulse for 1 command point. That's the dual purpose stratagem that could allow it to fall back and still shoot, or give -2 to charges for enemy units. Fall back and shoot is pretty handy if you do just need a few more anti-infantry shots in a pinch, but perhaps the -2 to charge could be truly devastating if the opponent doesn't see it coming. If they maybe declare a multi-charge including an Impulsor, it might stop their entire unit from getting into combat. Finally, as always with Space Marine vehicles, Armour of Contempt is an option, a 5+ mortal wound shrug off. So obviously as a transport the Impulsor does need some contents, so the question is what do you put in it to slingshot towards the enemy? It would seem that the stronger Space Marine lists that do well at tournaments almost always seem to use Blade Guard for this role. It's kind of interesting as they're an assault unit, so they're not really making full use of that assault vehicle special rule, as of course if you get out after the Impulsor moves then you can't charge after. However, just using it as a regular transport vehicle really does give them quite a lot of advantages. With the space in the Impulsor so limited, you really want to transport models that are all intensely dangerous in their own right, and at 35 points Blade Guard are really efficient damage dealers and pretty durable when they get out too. Blade Guard also perhaps gain the most out of the boosted movement from the Impulsor. They want to get into combat, but they only move 6 inches normally. Having an Impulsor move them up can be quite a nice move. As well as this though, it can be quite a nice option for including a support character alongside a unit of 5 Blade Guards. Captains and lieutenants are fighty in their own right and can give some rerolls, but it seems that a relatively common pick is the Judiciar, as again with a good movement it gives a good chance of delivering his fight's last ability into somewhere where it can take effect. If your opponent does shoot down the Impulsor in the midfield, they can all pile out, and they can try and arrange themselves so the Judiciar is protecting all the models, so no matter where your opponent charges the Blade Guard from, the opponent will still be fighting last. If you are taking a support character, then Rites of War isn't a bad warlord trait to have on them. The bubble of obsec that it gives is great on the Blade Guard. If they're getting where they need to be, up and fighting for objectives, then that's a nice way of taking those objectives against other enemy elites. Otherwise, the main two choices will be between Hellblasters or Intercessors. I don't think the Impulsor is particularly good for any of the Phobos units, as they can set up outside their deployment zone, perhaps their most powerful ability that's made redundant by piling them into an Impulsor. For shooting threat, maybe some Hellblasters plus a Captain could be a decent choice. Either the rapid fire or the assault variant seems good, though as they both do have at least some fairly decent range, it does make me wonder whether or not it's not just worth footslogging them and getting them in range that way anyway. Otherwise, a cheaper squad of Intercessors or Assault Intercessors could be handy. They could certainly make good use of the Impulsor's great movement and assault vehicle to ping them onto objectives and hopefully steal them right out from under the opponent's nose. Intercessors could also lay down a fair bit of firepower as well, hopefully with some good choices in line of sight after they've got out. Still though, Blade Guard are most certainly my favourite choice to put in the Impulsor. So how would I think about using it in game then? Firstly, I think they'd be more effective if either you can deploy them hidden, or if they are exposed to have multiple threatening targets, all of which are more pressing for your opponent's anti-tank. If you've got a bunch of Redemptor Dreadnoughts or Contemptors with the Volkites, your opponent might well be wanting to shoot them rather than a transport unit that isn't all that threatening in its own right. From there you can move up the board, potentially slingshotting units into aggressive positions, or potentially just hovering somewhere midfield as a bit of a battlefield bunker, keeping the squad inside safe for a turn, and then they could just disembark normally the following turn, move, shoot and charge. After the charging unit has got out, the Impulsor can be good for all sorts of things like normal transport vehicles. They can use their great movement to go over and contest objectives, block movement lanes to enemy advancing units, do nuisance charging to gunline models, or even just soak up any overwatch if your assault unit is worried about it. There's quite a lot of advantages in having a redundant transport about, even once the unit inside has got out. Overall, it would seem that the Impulsor is kind of at the borderline of being viable for competitive Space Marine lists. It does see a little bit of niche play in tournament topping lists, almost always bearing a shield dome and almost always carrying Blade Guard. Unfortunately, any sort of Primaris Impulsor rush just doesn't really seem to be all that common. I think if it were to be used as a bit more of a workhorse unit, they'd have to cost a little bit less in points. Overall though, certainly solid for slightly more casual gamers, and I think plenty of its other abilities could be pretty strong, aside from just the shield. In cutthroat competitive lists though, it's maybe just confined to slightly nicher uses. So let me know what you think of the Primaris transports down in the comments below. I look forward to hearing how you use yours. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with plenty more for the Space Marines. Finally, if you'd like to help support the channel, I would just like to mention the bits down in the video description below. There is of course that Element Games link that I mentioned earlier, discount Warhammer from the UK, and there's also the channel Patreon page as well, which is what allows me to make this much content quite so regularly. If you did want to support the channel on Patreon, backers do get a few rewards, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.